Israel moves toward coalition deal that could sideline Netanyahu. Naftali Bennett, an ultranationalist, and Yair Lapid, a centrist, have moved closer to forming a fragile coalition government that would oust the longtime Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. An ultranationalist power broker, Naftali Bennett, said on Sunday that his political party was ready to join several other opposition parties in a coalition, opening the door to forming Israel's first government since 2009 without Benjamin Netanyahu, the longest-serving prime minister in the country's history. If the maneuvering, which followed 2 months of indecision by Mr. Bennett, leads to a formal coalition agreement, it would be an uneasy alliance between 8 relatively small parties with a diffuse range of ideologies. The prime minister's post would rotate between 2 unlikely partners: Mr. Bennett, a former settler leader who rejects the concept of a sovereign Palestinian state and champions the religious right, and Yair Lapid, a former television host who is considered a voice of secular centrists. Mr. Bennett said in a speech Sunday night, "I will work with all my power to form a national unity government together with my friend Yair Lapid." Mr. Bennett's announcement came shortly after an armed conflict with Palestinians in Gaza that many thought had improved Mr. Netanyahu's chances of hanging on to his post. Because of the profound ideological differences within the emerging coalition, which would include both leftist and far-right members, its leaders have indicated their government would initially avoid pursuing initiatives that could exacerbate their political incompatibility, such as those related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and focus instead on infrastructure and economic policy. Any agreement reached in the coming days would need to be formally presented to Israel's president, Reuven Rivlin, by Wednesday night. It would still then need to be endorsed by a vote in the Knesset, the Hebrew name for the Israeli parliament. Under the deal being discussed, Mr. Bennett would lead the government first, probably until the fall of 2023, while Mr. Lapid would most likely serve as foreign minister, according to 2 people involved in the negotiations. The pair would then swap roles until a new general election in 2025. Mr. Bennett's party won fewer seats than Mr. Lapid's in a March election, but he holds significant leverage during the negotiations because no government can be formed without him. Their government would rely on the support of a small Arab Islamist party, Ram, to give it the 61 seats needed to control the 120-seat parliament. Mr. Netanyahu would remain as caretaker prime minister until the parliamentary vote. The negotiations for this coalition were almost derailed by the recent conflict with Hamas, the Palestinian group that controls the Gaza Strip. That made Mr. Bennett leery of forming a government reliant on Ram, which has roots in the same religious stream as the Gaza militants. If approved, the deal would mark the end of the Netanyahu era, at least for now. Supporters of the proposed coalition hope it could break the deadlock that has stymied government action for more than 2 years. Mr. Netanyahu, the leader of the right-wing Likud party, has been in office since 2009, following an earlier stint between 1996 and 1999. His 15 years in power make him Israel's longest-serving leader. It is 1 year longer than the combined terms of Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. Near the end of Mr. Netanyahu's tenure, he secured a major diplomatic prize with a set of groundbreaking normalization agreements between Israel and 4 Arab states. They shattered assumptions that Israel would stabilize its relationship with the Arab world only once it made peace with the Palestinians. Under Mr. Netanyahu, Israel also scored diplomatic victories with the United States. The Trump administration moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, closed its consulate for Palestinian affairs, shut down the Palestinian mission in the United States, and took a more combative line against Israel's enemy Iran. But the Israeli-Palestinian peace process collapsed under Mr. Netanyahu's watch, with formal negotiations petering out 7 years ago. And tensions with Israel's Arab minority increased, leading to widespread Arab-Jewish mob violence during the recent conflict. His government also enacted a law in 2018 that downgraded the status of the Arabic language in Israel and said that only Jews had the right to determine the nature of the Israeli state. Through an electoral agreement with far-right politicians, which ultimately allowed them to enter parliament, Mr. Netanyahu also contributed to a rise in far-right influence on public discourse. And by clinging to power while standing trial on corruption charges, critics said he undercut the rule of law, undermined democratic norms and could not give his full attention to governing while distracted by such a serious court case. Mr. Netanyahu denies the charges and defends his right to clear his name without leaving office. The case, and the polarizing effect it has had on the Israeli electorate, played a major role in Israel's political instability over the past 4 years. Mr. Netanyahu's decision to stay in office divided voters less by political belief than by their attitude toward him. In particular, it split the Israeli right, and made it harder for both Mr. Netanyahu and his opponents to form a working majority. That led to 4 inconclusive elections in 2 years, each of which ended with no faction being big enough to win power alone. The deadlock left the country without a state budget, among other problems. A desire to avoid a 5th election was a primary reason behind Mr. Bennett's decision, he said. It is either a 5th election or a unity government, he said. After the first 2 elections in 2019, Mr. Netanyahu was left in charge as a caretaker prime minister. Following the 3rd vote, in March 2020, he formed a government of national unity with his main rival, Benny Gantz, a shaky deal that collapsed last December when the 2 factions failed to agree on a state budget. A similar deadlock initially emerged after the most recent election in April. Mr. Rivlin, the president, granted Mr. Netanyahu, whose party finished first, an initial mandate to try to form a governing coalition. But he failed after a far-right group refused to enter a coalition reliant on Ram, which holds the balance of power. That gave Mr. Lapid, whose centrist party, Yesh Atid, or There Is a Future, came in second, the chance to form a government instead. His efforts were initially stymied by the outbreak of fighting between Israel and the Palestinians, which prompted his likely coalition partner, Mr. Bennett, to back out of coalition talks. But a ceasefire made it easier for the pair to restart negotiations, leading to the move on Sunday. Mr. Lapid, 57, is a former broadcaster who entered politics in 2012 and served as finance minister under Mr. Netanyahu in 2013. He was best known for moves to reshape a welfare system that gives money to devout Jewish men who study religious texts instead of seeking paid employment. Subsequent administrations reversed most of Mr. Lapid's changes. During the campaign, Mr. Lapid, 57, pledged to preserve checks and balances and to protect the judiciary. Mr. Bennett, 49, is a former Israeli army commando and software entrepreneur. He lives in Israel, but once led the Yesha Council, an umbrella group representing Jewish settlers in the occupied West Bank. Until January, his party was in a formal alliance with Bezalel Smotrich, a far-right leader. Mr. Bennett opposes Palestinian statehood and favors formally annexing large parts of the West Bank.